Hey everyone, I'm back with another game analysis, and this time my own game from an over-the-board tournament that I played this last weekend. From the Mid-America Open, which was in St. Louis, and I played in the under 2100 section. This was my first game, my round one game, and it was a nice game, and I had some good instructive moments I learned from it. I did manage to win this game, and I was playing against like a tiny kid. I think he was like 7 or maybe 8 years old. So I suspect that he might have been stronger than his rating. He was rated close to 1700, I think. But we got a Slav. And so, of course, we play the Slav exchange. We play this bishop g5. And I'm really hoping for knight f6 at some point. Either they play knight c6 first or they play h6. But I'm just hoping that they do this f6 line, because it's the line that I feel most comfortable with. Because after they take with this pawn or this pawn, we have an imbalance in the structure, and I think it's interesting and fun to play. But he played queen to b6 after some thought, and which is still something we're prepared for, but it's not likely I'm going to get the kind of pawn structure that I want. So I play knight c3, e6, queen d2, and knight c6, and then e3, and then he plays bishop to d6, which is the first move that like exits the repertoire. We cover bishop to e7 when we just exchange bishops, and we're happy here. So I'm thinking on my own already, and I'm looking at this position, and I'm trying to figure out like how do I want to play. And I thought that there were probably two ways to go. One was to just play on the c file and try to play knight a4, knight c5, and double the rooks, and maybe advance the a and the b pawns and just see what happens. The other idea is to try to engineer an e4 break at some point, which can be good. But it looked like it was going to be a lot more difficult to try to make this happen, especially with this queen on b6. So I just developed normally with bishop to d3, and then f6 came, which I suppose makes sense, but if they're going to play f6, they really should play it, like, immediately. But with this, I drop back, of course. I don't want to go to f4 and allow this annoying exchange. And then now knight to ge7 comes, and I played knight to f3. He played bishop to d7, and I was already kind of starting to be like worried that e5 was going to happen at some point. It turns out that tactically it's just not really possible just yet. So for example, if e5 immediately, oops, sorry, I get a move here, castles. If he castles and then I bring the rook to c1, and again, if he tries to play e5 instead, so something like e5 here, well, I can just take. He takes back, and actually, I can just grab this pawn, thanks to this tactic, which locks it in. And if he chose to play e5 even like a move earlier, it doesn't quite work yet here either. So for example, I can take, he can take, and then I can just castle, and he's struggling. He can't really castle yet. So bishop e6, if he castles immediately, for example, something like this, well, he's in big trouble, because I can play bishop takes e7, and he's got to take with the knight, otherwise this pawn will hang. And then after this, I can just take the pawn. And when he takes the knight back, this bishop c5 move is really quite nice. And there's another situation where he can't really do it either. So for example, in this line, if he plays bishop to e6, and we play the rook over, he castles, well, now we can play this bishop takes h7, and we get knight to g5, which hits this bishop, and he needs to move it, of course. So, and then we can just grab the bishop if he comes back, and he didn't really have any other option. But now, the rook's going to hang, we're going to get d5 instead, so e5 doesn't really work. I didn't actually see all of this during the game, but I did have a sense that if he played this e5, that there was going to be problems with the d5 square. So instead, that's not what happened. Instead, we played, again, we got knight f3, bishop d7, and then he castles, and I just brought the rook over to the c file. And here, he brought the bishop back, which I thought was a nice move, because, I had some ideas of maybe trying to bring the bishop back and create a battery, and this stops all of that. Makes it pretty obnoxious, and he can trade off this light square bishop anytime he likes. Here I immediately went knight to a4, which I should actually prepare this move, this is my first like big takeaway from this game, was that my bishop here on h4 is not really doing anything at all. You know, I had this idea that it was making e5 harder to play because there's some lines where we'll actually get to see where I can interpose with capturing this knight. But really, this bishop is much worse than this bishop, and I should just trade them. Which is an idea I probably should have been aware of, because if we look back to this line, the notes of the course, we're happy with the capture. This is what we cover in the course, we take, and then we develop naturally like this, and we can continue on with similar ideas. And the idea being that these squares are a bit weaker, especially the c5 square, because there's no bishop on it. So if we look back into the way the game actually went, if I would just play, say, bishop to g3, and then trying to capture this guy off, we would have a very similar type of structure, and perhaps even slightly better because of this f6 move, leaving this e6 square a bit weak, especially given that it turns out to be a bit tough to play e5. So this is something that I should have played that probably would have led to a little bit more comfortable position. Instead, after bishop to e8, I did play this knight out to a5. The queen comes in, and I went ahead and just jumped into c5 immediately. He took, and I took back with the rook. I mean, it might have been tempting to take with the pawn to try to get this 3-on-2, but I thought that's going to give him just a giant center, and I thought that would probably be pretty uncomfortable. So I took with the rook, he traded queens, and now played e5, which he can't really do. The point is I can just take, and he has to take back with the knight, because if he takes back with the pawn, well, now I can capture here, he captures here, I get rook c7, and I'm hitting this rook and this pawn, and I'm going to win material. And not only going to win material, but these pawns don't really look particularly great either. So after this series of exchanges, he went ahead and took the queen, and I took back, and now we take here, and he's got to take with a knight. And I had kind of an important decision here that I didn't play it quite right. I wasn't sure what I should do with the bishop, and my idea was to play bishop to c2 and then head to b3 and try to put pressure on this pawn, because I now have a target in the black camp that's a clear weakness, and probably going to be a weakness for a long time. But it turns out the c2 square is a little bit annoying, because I need this b3 square then for both pieces then, because I want the bishop there, and I'm going to need the knight there to route it to d4, because the knight clearly belongs on d4. Not only that, but on c2, I want to play rook to c1, and I'd like to have the rooks connected. So I really turned out to be pretty unhappy with this bishop to c2 move. And it turns out that a lot better is just to come back to e2. And, you know, I can reroute later. I can maybe at some point put it on f3. And then the other point that I just didn't really appreciate was that from e2, this bishop controls c4, which turns out to be important. Right now, it didn't seem like that was important because the knight is preventing this knight from coming to c4. But again, as I noted, I want the knight to go to b3 and then to d4, and then it'll be the bishop's job to cover the c4 square. So playing just bishop to e2 with the idea of bringing this rook over, bringing the knight up, and then out to d4 probably would have been a lot more comfortable way to handle the position. Instead, I played bishop to c2, and this bishop came out to f7, which I guess seems better than d8, but it's a little bit passive, just defending this pawn. And I brought the other rook across, and this felt a bit nervous, but it seemed like where the rook needed to be, because now this bishop can't even go to b3, because it's needed to cover the d3 square. So again, from e2, this bishop would have done a nice job of covering both the c4 and the d3 without blocking the rooks or getting in the way of the knight. And so here, he brought this knight across, and I just decided that, okay, I have to let the knight come to c4. I thought the most important thing about this position was this d5 pawn, and I did not want to allow this pawn to push, because then this bishop comes alive, and maybe we have some problems. So I just decided that for better or worse, I was going to allow the knight to come to c5, c4, and that even if I had to give up this pawn, this is probably for the best. I thought it was probably the best that I could do. So he did play knight to c4, and then I played my idea, knight to d4, and he can't exactly win a pawn because I can play, so for example, takes, I can just grab this pawn and take, and if instead he grabs here first, and then takes here, well, I have this move, and he's got to come back, and I take here, and I still have this weakness on the board, which seems like it's weaker than anything else. I do have the bishop pair, which seems like it might count for something. I can bring this bishop back. This knight can't get back to e5 to block, and I thought this was probably playable, but again, not quite as comfortable, and really sort of only forced because of this kind of awkward bishop to c2 move. This is a nice knight on c4. It's going to be somewhat tough to dislodge it. I mean, I can play the bishop and then capture, but then he has a passed pawn, and it would be sort of protected by the bishop, and then my own pawn comes under fire. So I really thought this was probably the best way for him to play, but he didn't go for this. So instead of capturing the knight, he instead just brought this knight in to support the knight on c4, and I just kicked this knight out. So this knight's got to move. He kicked my rook. I brought to c7, which I was happy. I kind of wanted to go to c7 anyway, and so I didn't see how this really helped him. He brought the knight to d6, and now I was actually pretty happy with my next move. I played bishop to f5, and my point is that I'm controlling this c8 square, making it difficult for him to ever challenge my rooks. I'm getting out of the way of this rook, and I'm still covering d3, and this bishop just didn't really feel like it had anywhere that useful to go. I mean, I could have went to d1, tried to come back to e2 now, but it's not clear what I was doing. So he captures, and I took back, and I thought that this knight on f5 is actually really dominant. He doesn't really want to advance his pawns on the king side, which he does later anyway, and he can never contest my rooks. I mean, even if I wanted to move my rooks across to try to double, he doesn't have an opportunity to come to the c8 square because I have this check. He'd have to take time to move his king, and I can probably get both my rooks to the 7th in time for that. So he drops this rook in. Excuse me. I attack the knight. It was probably better to immediately go to c6. But I thought if c6, I'll play here. But really, this is fine. I just put my rook right here on d6. Maybe I even have better. Perhaps like this check, and he's got to move away. And now I can go. I mean, I can still go rook d6. Looks good. Although, I actually have a nice tactic here. I can take this pawn. And he can't actually grab it because, well, this is just made immediately. So this would have been a nice thing to have seen, but playing rook to c3, it's still nice. I kicked the knight back. I brought the bishop in because I decided this bishop's not doing anything. And eventually, at some point, I'll probably just kick this guy and see what happens. He probably should bring the knight back to e6 and try to kick my rook out, but he didn't opt to do that. He came back forward, and now I bring the rook into c6. And this is quite a comfortable position for me. I have total control over the only file. I've blockaded his pawn firmly. Even if he does just give up the pawn, the bishop doesn't actually get that much extra scope because of the pawn on b3. And this knight looks nice. It's his best piece, but he's not really doing anything. I'm probably going to be pretty happy if he ever just captures the bishop. So instead, he tries to kick me. I just, of course, come back. And now we have a new weakness. So now this knight is responsible for defending this pawn. He brings the rook across because it's not sure where else he's going to go. And here I actually had an opportunity to do a nice idea that I thought about, but I was sort of too chicken. It felt too committal. I could play f3, which kind of forces him to capture. I'll capture here, and if he wants to grab this pawn, well, this is big trouble because now I can grab this guy, and this bishop is really struggling to find a square to go to. For example, if it tries to just move out of the way, well, I can just kick this rook, and where does it go? It has to go to e5, I suppose. And this is just a really nice dominant position. And I wanted to do this, but it seemed a little bit shaky. It wasn't clear to me. It seemed too committal, and I didn't have to do it. So instead of playing something like that, I decided, let me just provoke. I played knight to b5. The idea is I'm sort of hitting this pawn, and I thought I could induce him to advance those pawns up the board, and they would probably be a little bit weaker this way, which is kind of exactly what happened. He really should just sit and not react to this knight, because I'm not actually really ever threatening to take. For example, knight takes. Well, now my knight's kind of stuck on a7 because this pawn on a2 is going to hang, and it's not great. And if I take with the rook, well, he can capture, then I take with the knight, and then when I come across here, I would have to play rook to c7 to defend the knight, and then knight's stuck for a while. So instead, he chose to advance the pawn, which I kind of wanted. I played here, he advanced again, and again, he's kind of stuck somewhere without any real plans or anything really that active to do. I played another move I thought was just sort of provoking. I wasn't planning to do anything. I didn't have any real idea with this bishop to f4. I just thought, let me make a move, and you make a move, and we'll see what you do. And he chose to play g5, which again is another kind of committal move. Notice I get the f5 square back now. You know, I was kind of making him think maybe I'm going to come to h6 and it's going to be uncomfortable for his king. I'm not really going to do that. But again, okay, so he pushes, I drop back, and he plays h5 now. Looks like he's maybe going to trap my bishop, but he's just not. I went here, and my threat is huge. I'm just threatening to play knight h6 and pick up the bishop. So he brings the king to f8. It's already really struggling to find out what he's going to do. King to f8 is actually kind of the best move. But now I give this check, and he's got to grab it, because if he drops the king back, if he goes back to g8, well then I get this move, and I'm just gonna win a flat piece. So he takes, I take. Now the rook's hanging, so he has to do this, and I just take, and I give this check coming back, and I pick up f6, and I'm hitting the rook. So now I have hitting the bishop. So now I already have a real material advantage. He comes here, and I come back to d4, and now I'm threatening to win this again. He brings this rook in. Let's not get mated. I played h3, but really, actually, h4 is better because he's got to deal with this bishop, and I would just win a pawn. But I'm going to win a lot of pawns anyway. So he moves. I capture this one. He gives a check. I come here. He advances the pawn. I come here. I'm going to grab this guy. I'm fine. You can have my a pawn. I bring the king out to defend the f2. He gives a check, and now he comes back. And I suppose he was afraid that I was going to give a check here, and he can't go to the back rank, and maybe his king would feel a bit stranded. But I would have decided I'm just going to cut the king off again. I'm just going to come over. I'm going to collect these two pawns and run up the board, which is more or less what happens. He comes here, kind of threatening a check. I get out of the way of it so that I can play just f3. He brought over to try to kick my rook, but now I have a new threat. I'm threatening to play here and exchange the rooks. And his king will be way offside. There's not really anything he can do about this. So I went here, and then we exchanged the rooks. I played f3. He's going to come around and he gets one pawn, but I have a bunch. So I came here, play f5, and I'm not really actually threatening to advance this pawn anymore. I'm just shielding the bishop away from this h7 square so I can advance the h-pawn. He tries to bring a king in, and I like this move king f6. It seems weird that we're shutting our own pawn in, but now I'm keeping his bishop out. So I've shut his bishop out, and now I've shut his king out, and I can just walk this pawn up the board, and after my pawn reached h7, he resigned. So I had quite a nice first game. I was pretty happy with the way that this went. There were two kind of big takeaways here. One earlier on was after we get to this point in the game, right before I played knight to a4, this idea of let's trade off these bishops. This is a really good bishop for him and a really bad bishop for me, and I get something of an edge after this. His bishop position just becomes a little bit airy. And then the next moment that I thought was important was, again, after I went knight c5, and we had this opportunity here where I needed to move this bishop, recognizing that the bishop belongs on e2 and to control c4. And that I don't want to shut in the rooks off the c-file. And again, I think this is a somewhat of a better way for me to have gone. Anyhow, I hope that this was instructive for you guys and you took something out of it. Thanks a lot. I wish you the best. Bye-bye.